Hello, everyone. I'd like to talk to you today about research paradigms. And by that, I mean the different philosophical approaches researchers within the field of communication take to the study of communication. Now, these different philosophies are coming from a whole bunch of different backgrounds, such as biological perspectives, psychological perspectives, and across the humanities as well. And that is part of the nature of the field of communication. And so there's going to be a lot of different ideas and words here. The whole point of this video is that I can explain those terms to you so you can hopefully start making some more sense. Because sometimes this stuff looks a little confusing from the outside. And often people are arguing, even within the field, from very different philosophical perspectives. And so there's not really a one-size-fits-all approach to the generation of scholarly material within the field of communication. But looking at the research paradigms that different scholars use can help us better understand different philosophical approaches to scholarly work. And that applies to different fields from biology to psychology to the humanities, rhetoric, critical approaches, all this stuff. And my goal is to help you better understand these different philosophical approaches. That's good not just for this class, but going out in the world, engaging with technical information, and getting into arguments with people on Facebook and in bars, if that's your thing too. But let's get into it so we can have a better understanding as to what a research paradigm is and how it works. I'm going to do this kind of quick, so feel free to rewatch this video. I'm going to try and keep it, as always, between 10-15 minutes and give you a breakdown, but I tend to talk kind of quickly, so if you miss anything, feel free to rewatch this. This should be a good reference for you. Now, getting into definitions, let's start with that. That's always a good place to start, because if we don't have the same definition, we can't really discuss these things. Now, a paradigm is generally referred to as a researcher's worldview. This is a good way to think of it. It is a conceptual framework, right? A system of concepts that serves as the researcher's worldview. It shapes the way a researcher approaches the process of generating knowledge. Think back for a moment to any class you've ever taken, whether that's high school biology or high school English or any level of those different things. But when you take those classes, there is a method, there's a system by which you are being instructed to approximate truth or reality or generate knowledge, right? In your English class, it's a little more subjective, right? You can read the book, and if you can make an argument about why that character did a certain thing and what that's a symbol of, well, hey, then that's a valid perspective. It's a little different in science, right? You are trying to be methodological, you're trying to be systematic, you perform an experiment, you set your expectations out beforehand, and then you try and prove or disprove them. These are different paradigms, a researcher's worldview, right? It's a conceptual framework that helps you make sense of the world. Now, that's not to say anything as to the validity of these different paradigms, and what you'll see through this discussion is that in the field of communication, I will encourage you to think of the different paradigms as useful for different purposes. It doesn't necessarily mean that one's better than another one. I have my preferences and other people have theirs, but they are definitely better for doing different things. So we need to make an important distinction between the three main paradigms in the field of communication. And that distinction is the nature of knowledge and how we view reality. So while I just said that these different paradigms will be better served for different purposes, there will come a point that if you take these things to their logical conclusion, that you might find that they don't agree with each other in terms of how reality is and how it functions. And that can get us into some trouble. So now the basic truth here is that all humans are capable of thinking in all these different ways, and we do it routinely. But we want to be careful about the assumptions that we are using to generate knowledge and view the nature of reality. All right, it's time to start getting technical. So what you're looking at here is the beginnings of what's going to end up being kind of a complicated diagram. This is coming from a book about sociological paradigms from 1979 by Burrell and Morgan. Now, this is generally regarded as one of the sources for these various distinctions, and they saw a problem in that people who are studying human behavior, we're arguing essentially from different perspectives and arguing about different things. So this is one of the earliest ways in which paradigms have been conceptualized. So beginning with these two axes, I want to start making sense as to what the paradigms do. Now, don't worry about this big word at the top. Epistemology just has to do with the philosophy of the nature of knowledge. Okay, so here we're talking about how these paradigms are characterized in the different ways they view knowledge and its nature. So let's talk about the first axis here. This one I'm going to just go ahead and label for now as the type of evidence that the paradigm is using. Okay, so is it a little bit more on the subjective side of evidence, right? Anecdotes or stories, personal experience, or is it trying to be more universal in terms of performing experiments or generalizing huge universal truths? Are we trying to figure out what gravity is like, what drives it, what causes it? Or are we talking about what it's like to fall, right? What is the subjective experience here? But that's the first axis. So the paradigms differ in terms of what kind of evidence, what kind of truth they're trying to generalize. The second axis here might be considered what the paradigm is trying to accomplish. Now, Burrell and Morgan originally kind of described this in terms of, is it trying to describe or regulate the status quo, or is it trying to actively change it? And this was kind of one of the first characterizations of how these different paradigms work. And you can see how those might be at odds, right? And this can get confusing really quickly, and we could start arguing about this right now, because someone who is falling into the category of more regulatory might say, well, I'm trying to generate knowledge, I'm trying to approximate knowledge so that we can change things perhaps. Whereas someone who's more of a critical person might say, I'm just, first and foremost, things are corrupt, I'm trying to change those things with my paradigm and my approach. This will make more sense as we look at examples of these different things. So what are they trying to do? What does it look like for a paradigm to be in one of these given quadrants? Well, a paradigm that is, again, trying to change things and relying on universal truths or trying to generalize things in a more universal way, well, they're going to end up making ethical or moral arguments. This would be what we call a critical paradigm, right? So they're trying to change things, and they're trying to change things based on these assumptions they have about the nature of reality, namely that it is corrupt, systems are corrupt and oppressive, right? So this would be the critical paradigm down here. On the other hand, people who are, again, using universal truths or universal standards of evidence or trying to approximate something that is larger scale, this is some sort of actual truth, in quotes, and they're using, but they're trying to describe reality, or maybe they're not worried about change, so shall we say. They're trying to describe things accurately. Well, they're going to depend more on facts and data-driven research, and that's going to be more important to them, trying to approximate what is truly universal so that we can better understand reality. On the other side of things, if subjective evidence is important, human experience, well, that might be more on the artistic side of things, right? Think about like interpretive dance or something, or people really like to argue about what is art, right? Do you have to get something I'm doing for it to count as art, right? That's very, very subjective, but they would probably argue that it's trying to change things. It's trying to trigger you in thinking in a different way, drive towards some different outcomes, whatever it may be. A more systematic approach, right, on the side of regulation might be what's called thick description. This is an interpretive paradigm where it's trying to systematically describe something like human experience, as in the case of anthropology, right? They're looking at a specific group of people and they're trying to describe what it's like to be those people. So again, it's very subjective, but it's very systematic. That would be the interpretive paradigm over here. Now we can complicate our diagram a little bit more. I've added a few more labels, but it's not changing things in a fundamental way. This is still sticking with Burrell and Morgan's description of things, right? But you can see some of the terms I've just given you. For instance, in this upper right quadrant is the social science. This is when a social scientist says they're a social scientist, this is what they're talking about. We are interested in universal truths or trying to approximate them. And a social scientist will say, just because we may not be able to know things to be absolutely true doesn't mean we shouldn't try to understand them, right? So the burden of proof will be trying to find more generalizable, universal sources of evidence, as in statistics, right? It's data driven, and we are in statistics, we're increasing our number of observations, is the technical way of saying this. We ask a lot more people about their given experience so that we can get closer to what we would assume is a more universal, generalizable truth about those people. So you increase your number of observations so that you can get a better sense as to what's happening. That's statistics, and it's social science. Other things that are going to fall into this category would probably be psychology, performing experiments and things like that to try and get at what are there any universal truths that we can try and measure. So that's going to fall in the upper right quadrant here. In the below that, still arguing about universal truths, but the what counts as evidence might be a little bit different, but the goals are definitely different over here. Again, this is the critical paradigm. The goal is to change things, right? You look at the movie, you don't like the representation of a given group or the way they do a certain thing, and that you make an ethical or moral judgment about how things should be changed. This would be considered radical structuralism, according to Burrell and Morgan. So it's radical in the sense that it's pushing for change, but it's structural in the sense that it is assuming, again, that these are universal truths about our society or whatever it may be, right? There's this structural aspect to it. There is an external truth, and we're trying to change it, right? There is an existent structure, and we want to change it. So that's where it's radical structuralism. Over on the other side, you have radical humanism, right? The difference being that it's focused on subjective experience, right? So rather than saying, it's not trying to make claims necessarily about the whole universe or all of human experience. The art itself isn't really worried about changing the whole world, depending on their level of hubris, but it is interested in changing your perspective. Right? So that might be an argument. Now, rhetoric is following kind of those rules, though interested in often political speeches and things like that. So it's following kind of those same standards. But again, it is focused on change. And you can already see how that's going to start getting complicated, right? So if you are using the study of rhetoric in politics to change things that you're assuming are structural or universal, well, you might run the risk of using too much anecdotal evidence. This is where we start getting into cherry picking or straw person arguments or something like that. Those fallacies are when rhetoric goes wrong, right? But at any rate, up above that, still on the subjective side of things, we have interpretive sociology. So as I mentioned before, this is sometimes called thick description. And that the reason for that is it might be, you know, a short story that is written about the experience of a small town cop. That is an actual interpretive study that has been done. It's based on research. It's based on anthropological research of those people's experience. And that's what's called thick description, right? It's going to be an elaboration on that. It's not really necessarily trying to change anything. It's trying to describe a specific experience. So qualitative stuff usually falls in this category. You can also have mixed methods and things like that, which is using qualitative data often to inform quantitative methods, your statistics and your experiments. So this is a complicated way of looking at these things, but hopefully it makes a little bit more sense. Now, I'm going to try to simplify it in the remainder of this this video, just so that we can make this more useful to us in a lay sense. All right, in this diagram, the only thing I've changed is these two labels, systematic and associative. And I want to explain that briefly, just because Burrell and Morgan is well, they wrote that book in a particular cultural context coming out of the civil rights movement and things like that. And so being radical and arguing for change, well, hey, we might be coming full circle to that now, but at that point, that was what was forefront. In the years that followed that, um, people maybe got a little bit more focused on the methodological consequences of these characterizations. So if you want to think about it in terms of the methodology or what these different paradigms do, then it might be more helpful to think of these terms. So again, when it comes to something that is interpretive or the social sciences, what they really have in common is that they're very systematic and rigorous. They have established practices that they go through. Now, of course, every paradigm has its own practices, its own methodology. But the point of being rigorous in something like social science is that you have a reproducible system so that you can compare apples to apples rather than apples to oranges, where the other paradigms might not be as concerned about that. That's why I put down here associative. So when you're on this side of the spectrum, what they're really interested in is it's more of a formal logic kind of methodology, right? A couple of examples could stand in for universal truths. Like it's still evidence, but it's not trying to be as exhaustive or systematic. Instead, it's trying to draw associations between specific manifestations of the patterns they're trying to observe. All that background was to try and get us to conceptualize things in a bit of a simpler way, but I really do believe it's important. So here's another simpler way you can look at it. And most modern communication studies or programs will conceptualize it in terms of three different paradigms. So you've got social science, critical, and interpretive, essentially kind of distilling it down a little bit. And I've taken the liberty of putting it in a Venn diagram because who doesn't like Venn diagrams? Now, over here, you can see that what social science and critical paradigms have in common is that they are really interested in evidence-based claims, but the standard of evidence might be different. Right? The critical and interpretive paradigm, they might share the fact that they're interested in subjective experience. Like the individual's experience might be proof enough for the critical paradigm, right? Well, this happens to a small group of people. It happens to me, and therefore that is evidence enough that the system needs to be revised or revisited, right? It's taking a couple anecdotes often and using that as the proof. What the interpretive paradigm and social science paradigm have in common is, again, it's kind of systematic. They're very interested in reproducible results, or at least being consistent so that you have some standard of measurement. Might not always agree about what counts as evidence, again, or what their goals are, but they have some stuff in common. So all three of these overlap, and my main reason for putting them in this kind of Venn diagram is to focus on this part right here. In the middle, I would call that human experience. As I stated earlier on in this video, all humans are capable of and do think in all these different paradigms at various different times. And that's fine. That's important, right? But it can lead to some problems. Let's summarize these three different paradigms for the purposes of this course. This is how I want you to keep things in mind. This is what you'll be held accountable for knowing. So interpretive, the fundamental assumption is that reality is subjective and socially constructed, right? The individual's experience is paramount. And based on all of our collective individual experiences, that's how we create our reality. That's how society is built. And that's what people mean when they say something is socially constructed, right? It is the way it is because we agree that it is. They're saying that there's nothing fundamental about the nature of reality other than our individual experience and our collective experience. That's why it's been called a thick description when we're doing it methodologically. It's saying that knowledge is contextual from the perspective of the people studied. It is a creative and value-laden process, and it is supposed to be based on its fundamental assumptions. Social science, on the other hand, is assuming at a fundamental level that reality is knowable and discoverable, and that is the goal, is to try and know and discover things about reality in the social sciences. Again, it's Even if we can't know things to be absolutely true, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to approximate the truth. And that is the fundamental assumption about social science. In statistics, post-positivism is the current philosophical norm. Post-positivism is agreeing that we can't know things to be absolutely true, but we can certainly try to disprove them, and that gets us closer to the truth. So we're seeking to predict behavior through objective, precise, systematic, and repetitive processes of discovery. The critical paradigm, again, the fundamental assumption, like interpretive, is that reality is subjective and socially constructed. And postmodernist is a term that is often used to describe critical paradigms and approaches. And that is saying that subjective reality is a tool for deconstructing the status quo or established systems of thought. Here, they're operating from the idea that these structures are corrupt and oppressive and they should be revised, and we're using subjective experience and reality as a tool for that. Much like interpretive, because things are socially constructed, we're saying that things are the way they are because we agree that they are that way. So when you see people arguing about, for instance, identity or gender politics, is gender a thing? Is biological sex a thing? And some people will say that gender is only a thing because we agree it is the way it is, whereas a social scientist would say, no, that's not how it works. Biological sex is a thing. Yes, gender might be changed and influenced by culture, but there's something fundamentally different about men and women, right? So you can see how these different paradigms would operate in their practical applications, and you can see how they would start arguing with each other. Here's one more way to think about these different paradigms, and I will admit right up front that this would be probably fairly controversial, that this is coming from my perspective, which is a social scientific perspective, and I'm sure if any rhetoricians or interpretive scholars watch this video, they would already be arguing with me in the comments, but I will stress again that I'm not trying to tell you to think in any particular way, but to understand the differences between these as best as possible. But you could compare these different paradigms to what they do to different stages in, say, a classical social scientific research process. That might help you keep them apart. This is how I think of it. Again, you don't have to think of it this way, and a lot of people would be mad at me for characterizing it this way. But step one, you want to identify and describe a problem, for instance. Interpretive or qualitative research is great for this, and this is where mixed methods comes from, right? You use a focus group to describe a problem that group is experiencing. Then you move on to test the validity of that concern and the relationships between the desired variables. This is what social scientists do with hypothesis testing, right? From my focus group, I learn about a specific problem, but then I want to know how widespread that problem is. So I need to increase the number of observations to see where it's occurring. And then once we have a sense as to whether or not something is true, in a more generalizable objective sense, then we could describe or prescribe corrective measures. And critical scholarship is really good at this, right? So every researcher is going to be doing all three of these things at some different point. You only run into trouble if you start substituting one step for another. So for instance, you don't worry about testing the validity of a relationship, but you're going to prescribe, say, policy changes based on a subjective observation. That's where we start running into policy problems and the kinds of laws that people really don't think are appropriate or actually solving problems. So again, keep in mind that many people will disagree with this characterization, believing that each paradigm is best suited for particular problems rather than they should be arranged hierarchically in this kind of way. So I've, of course, gone over my time. I apologize for that, but this is all very important information, and I hope that it can be beneficial to you as you go forward. So benefits and limitations of these different paradigms will end with this. Each research paradigm has its strengths and limitations, but they do tend to answer different kinds of questions. So for now, I would like you to keep in mind that each has a specific purpose, and they're pretty good at those different purposes. So are you trying to predict behavior, describe behavior, or change it? So if you're trying to predict behavior, you're going to probably be a bit more social scientific. You want to know the relationships between variables. If you're trying to describe behavior, well, that's by nature interpretive. You're looking at it and describing it as accurately or as truthfully and faithfully as you can? Or are you trying to change people's behavior on the large scale? Well, that is critical in its nature. So I hope this helps you understand better what I mean by a research paradigm, and it also should help you figure out how to approach these kinds of discussions. And these discussions are becoming more and more important as the geopolitical climate gets more complex and times change and people are interacting and arguing with each other a lot more. It's important that we are arguing from a similar starting point or we may never make any headway. All right, I've taken up enough of your time. Thank you for listening. I hope this helps, and I'll be in touch again soon.